They did not kill him with a sword. They killed him with symbolism. His body was the stage, his flesh the parchment, and his genitals the final punctuation in a sentence written by power, not law. He was dragged into the square at dawn, bound and bloodied, but not yet broken. His face bore the swollen markings of nights without sleep, of fists without mercy. Yet nothing that came before prepared him, or the crowd, for what came next. His legs were forced apart, his garments shredded, not for exposure, but for ritual. The executioner did not speak. He reached down with a blade, honed not for speed, but for ceremony, and with a single practiced motion he severed the man's genitals from his body. The scream that followed tore the air open, but it was not the scream that silenced the crowd. It was what happened next. The severed parts were not discarded, they were held aloft, dripping, pulsing, still twitching with the memory of life. And then, without a word, they were thrown into the mass of bodies gathered to witness, into the audience, into the people, bloodied flesh hurled not in shame, but in instruction. This was not punishment, it was pedagogy, a lesson etched into viscera, that power could unmake you, not just kill you, that even your most intimate anatomy, your most private claim to self, could be rendered public and meaningless in an instant. No one moved to catch the pieces, but no one screamed either. The silence was not grief, it was complicity. They watched because they had to, because to look away was to risk being next, because the state had constructed a spectacle so complete that to flinch would be treason. This was a justice built not on guilt, but on performance, and performance needs a crowd. The man, now convulsing in a pool of his own identity, no longer represented a threat. He represented a conclusion. The arc of state violence brought to its most intimate and final form. And yet, this was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was not vengeance by a mad king, nor savagery from a drunken mob. It was procedure. A carefully codified ritual for traitors, heretics, or favorites who flew too close to the sun of royal favor. This was the sanctioned severing of legacy. To remove a man's genitals is to remove his lineage, his virility, his symbolic potency. And to do it publicly is to strip not only his future but his history, to say, this man was never sovereign, never sacred, never even whole. Because in the eyes of the state, he had already been castrated, socially, politically, morally. The blade was just confirmation. Before he became a body desecrated in public, he was a man elevated too quickly, too visibly, too dangerously. His name was whispered in court long before it was ever shouted in the streets. He was not of royal blood, but worse, he was close to it. Close enough to influence, to whisper at the right moment, to command decisions without ever holding office. He was a favorite, the kind who does not inherit power but is invited into its bedchamber, the kind who in every generation becomes the mirror the nobility wants shattered. Because to be a favorite is to exist in contradiction, formally beneath the king but functionally above the law. And that cannot be allowed for long. He began in service, skilled, charismatic, loyal to the crown, but not to the customs. He rose not by land, but by proximity. He understood the king's moods, his silences, his needs. He made himself indispensable, and with each passing month, his name appeared more often on documents. His signature crept closer to the margins of authority. Gifts were bestowed, lands confiscated from old enemies, titles that once belonged to old bloodlines, rings once worn by knights whose sons now stared at him with clenched jaws. It was not that he ruled, it was that he reminded them how close rule could come to anyone, especially someone like him. The court grew restless. Murmurs turned to letters, accusations not of crime, but of influence. They said he slept too close to the king, stood too tall beside him, wore his velvet too well. They called him arrogant, but what they meant was visible. He did not hide his assent. He did not lower his eyes. He did not defer. He hosted feasts in castles that had never belonged to his family. He hired musicians to praise his name. He walked through courtyards as if he had built them, and the noble houses, starved of favor, drenched in tradition, watched with teeth grinding. The rumors began with innuendo, that he had seduced the king, that he dictated appointments, dismissed generals, even intercepted letters meant for the queen. Perhaps some were true, perhaps none were. It did not matter. Truth has no place in court politics once envy becomes strategy. Alliances formed not around ideology, but resentment. Old barons whose grandfathers had died for the crown now plotted to sever the grip of a man they saw as illegitimate, an infection beneath royal robes. The queen herself, once silent, began to speak. Her dignity, long eroded by political sidelining, found new voice in opposition. She did not need to accuse, she only needed to imply. That the king had been bewitched, that her husband no longer ruled with reason but desire, that the nation bled while this man drank from jeweled goblets he had not earned. Her letters traveled farther than any battalion. She found allies abroad, and when she returned with her son at her side and an army at her back, the favorite had nowhere to run. He was captured before he understood the full betrayal. The king's banner was still flying, but the soldiers now obeyed others. He was dragged from his chamber, stripped of his finery, bound not as a prisoner of war, but as an object of ritual. The charges were vague: treason, corruption, perversion. No evidence was needed. He had become, in their eyes, a symbol, and symbols are not tried. They are destroyed. His captors made no effort to shield him from the public. On the contrary, they made him visible again, not in robes, but in rags, not on horseback, but in chains. They paraded him through towns where children had once sung his praises. Now they threw mud, spit, curses. He was no longer a man. He was an object of unburdening, a scapegoat for every famine, every failed law, every humiliation suffered in a kingdom that had stopped believing in its own hierarchy. They led him to the square, not to execute a criminal, but to erase a symbol. And so they prepared the knives, the ropes, the iron clamps, and the crowd came, not to see justice, but to see a man reduced below memory. The execution was not a sentence, it was a script. Each step had been rehearsed in centuries of precedent, etched into the architecture of power and the memory of mobs. What awaited him in the square was not death, but dismemberment masquerading as law. When they dragged him to the scaffold, the sun had barely risen, yet the crowd already swelled beyond the outer cordons. Men clutched children to their hips. Women leaned from windows. Priests stood silent. They had come not for truth, but for spectacle, because in this society the fall of a favorite was not a scandal, it was theatre. First came the confession, or rather its performance. The clerk read aloud a list of alleged crimes: seduction of the king, theft of crown revenues, the alienation of noble families, the betrayal of the realm. Each line was met not with proof, but with cheers. The audience needed no evidence. They had been fed the story in whispers for months. They knew what he had done, or what he symbolized, which was now the same thing. The clerk paused for response. The man said nothing. His lips were cracked. His wrists bled. His silence was not defiance. It was exhaustion. Then they stripped him. Not hastily, but ceremonially, garment by garment, until his body, once draped in velvet and brocade, stood exposed, vulnerable, pale, bruised. The human form reintroduced to the public not as a vessel of dignity, but as a blank page for punishment. The executioner approached, not a butcher, but an artisan of pain. He carried no axe, no rope, just a short blade, curved slightly, with a handle worn by years of use, the tool of selective mutilation. They began with the genitals, always the genitals, because to remove a man's reproductive organs was not simply to wound, it was to unright him, to sever the line of future, to deny him even the hypothetical of legacy. It was not death, it was deletion. The blade entered with precision, the skin split, the cords ruptured, blood sprayed in a thick arc across the platform. His scream was delayed, his body still catching up to the horror of itself. When it came, it was not loud. It was broken, a gasp cut into by sobs, half-choked, half-prayer. The severed flesh was raised, displayed, then thrown into the crowd. No one moved to catch it, but no one turned away. It landed with a sound that was not a thud, but a slap. Software wet, final. The point had been made. Not just that this man had fallen, but that he would never rise again. Not in story, not in rumor, not in bloodline. His body had been transformed into an argument, and every spectator had been made part of it. But they were not finished. His abdomen was opened next, not for execution, but for exposure. His intestines were pulled out slowly, loop by loop, and piled beside him. The goal was not to kill swiftly, but to kill thoroughly, to show that a traitor's insides were not sacred, that his blood could be counted in pints, and his organs named aloud like verses in a litany of state vengeance. The stench was unbearable. The heat of opened flesh mixed with the cold morning air. Some in the crowd retched, others wept, a few cheered. By the time they reached his heart, he was likely unconscious. But the ritual demanded completion. His chest was opened with hammers, his ribs cracked audibly. The heart was removed, not simply to end the life, but to declare it over in every possible way. And when it was done, the pieces were carted to different gates of the city. His genitals, intestines, hands, and head, each nailed to a post. A warning not just of crime, but of closeness. Of what happens when a man without bloodline dares to sit too near the throne. No burial was offered, no name inscribed. His remains, scattered, became part of the landscape, eaten by crows, washed by rain, forgotten, except by those who knew what they had seen. Because this was not justice, it was a ritual. And rituals are never accidental. There is a line that, once crossed, transforms punishment into performance. And that line was crossed not with the blade, but with the crowd. When his severed genitals were lifted, paraded, and hurled into the mass of silent watchers, the body was no longer simply being destroyed. It was being used. His flesh became a weapon. Not against him, he was already lost, but against memory, against defiance, against the very idea that power might be intimate, human, or flawed. The public mutilation of this man's anatomy was a message spelled in blood. Not only will we kill you, we will unman you, unwrite you, and use your own body to stain the consciousness of those who dared to look. This was not about sin. It was about symbolism. Genital mutilation, especially in public, is the ultimate reversal of masculine order. It is the eradication of lineage, potency, voice. To cut off a man's penis in front of witnesses is to say his desires, his closeness to the king, his imagined importance. None of it survives our blade. And to throw that part to the crowd is to deputize them as witnesses, yes, but more darkly, as accomplices. Their silence completes the ritual. Their stillness becomes affirmation. No one needs to cheer. The absence of revolt is enough. The flesh, as it landed among boots and cloaks, did not scream, but his memory did. The body, now limp and gutted, bore no resemblance to the man who had once shaped royal policy with whispered words. He had become a specimen, dissected, displayed and scattered. No part of him was buried whole. His head went to the southern gate, his hands to the marketplace. His heart, by some accounts, was burned, not for purification, but to ensure nothing of him could be venerated. Even his soul, they believed, had to be denied. And what did the king say? Nothing. Silence, in this context, was the final blade. Royal approval cloaked in royal absence. The monarch did not order the mutilation, not in words, but he permitted the theatre. He sanctioned the forgetting. Because power, when threatened, does not always strike directly. Sometimes it allows others to do the bleeding, so it can remain clean. Years later, chroniclers debated whether the execution had gone too far. Some called it excessive, others necessary, but none denied that it had worked. There were no more favorites like him, no more men elevated beyond the reach of nobles, no more whispers in corridors about private influence shaping public fate. His death had become a boundary, a warning, an erasure, and yet he was not entirely erased, because violence that public cannot be undone. Bodies decay, but rituals echo, and every gate where his remains were nailed, every child who glimpsed the organs thrown like meat, every silence that followed the scream, those became part of history, whether written or not. His body had been a threat, so they dismantled it. His flesh had held meaning, so they weaponized it. He had been a man, and so they made him a message. They said his name only once, and even then, not with reverence, just a murmur before the clerk read the charges. After that, he ceased to be a man. He became an object of protocol, a collection of accusations, a schedule of punishments, an anatomy mapped for destruction. And when the final act was done, when his organs had been scattered, his limbs nailed to gates, his heart obliterated, the court spoke of stability, of order restored. But stability built on mutilation does not endure. It festers. What the state feared was not his body. It was his closeness, his influence, his reminder that power can be seduced, swayed, softened, and so they unmade him where he was most symbolic. In the groin, in the gut, in the chest. Each cut was not just execution, it was inversion, sovereignty turned inside out, masculinity nullified, memory cauterized. But violence that precise always says more about the system than the man. A kingdom confident in its authority does not need to castrate to maintain it. A crown secure in its command does not flinch at proximity. But this regime flinched, and in its flinch, it revealed something, that its terror of fragility was greater than its claim to divine right. He did not rise. But his death lingers, not in praise, but in the architecture of fear, in every public square that still draws crowds for punishment, in every execution designed to shame, not just end. His flesh, discarded as waste, became an archive, and what they tried to erase became a record. Because the body remembers, because silence fails, because history, even in its most brutal moments, leaves stains, and because every system that teaches obedience with a blade will eventually face the question, what kind of justice needs to throw genitals to a crowd? If you want to hear more of the stories they tried to bury, subscribe. We don't just remember, we reveal.